The morning sun was bright, and the airport was full of noise and rushing footsteps. People were pulling their bags, children were crying, and announcements echoed across the halls. It was just another busy day of travel on this particular flight. Passengers slowly lined up, handing over their tickets and stepping into the plane. Some looked tired, some excited, and some nervous. But everyone just wanted to reach their destination. Among the crowd was a family who carried themselves with quiet confidence. A tall man walked beside his wife, their children close by. They were dressed neatly, the man in a sharp suit, the woman in a graceful dress, and the children in clean, comfortable clothes. They didn't seem loud or demanding, but there was something about their calm, dignified way that made them stand out. People glanced at them, some with curiosity, others with silent judgment. The flight attendant on duty was watching carefully. She had been working for years, and she believed she could read passengers easily. Something about this family caught her attention not because they did anything wrong, but because she thought they looked too important for economy class. In her mind, they didn't belong there. Maybe it was their confident way of walking. Maybe it was their skin color, or maybe it was her own bias she never admitted. Whatever it was, a small seed of doubt grew inside her. The family walked to their seats, smiling politely at other passengers. The father helped his children with their bags. The mother carefully placed her purse under the seat. They looked happy to travel together, whispering to each other about the trip ahead. But the flight attendant's eyes stayed on them. She wondered if their tickets were real, or if they had somehow taken seats they shouldn't have. She didn't check other passengers with the same suspicion, only them. Around them, the plane was alive with normal activity. A businessman typed quickly on his laptop, trying to finish work before takeoff. A young couple laughed softly, taking selfies. An elderly lady read her newspaper with her glasses low on her nose. No one knew that something unusual was about to happen. For now, it was just a typical flight, with the steady hum of people settling. Down the children of the family were cheerful, asking questions about flying. "Will the clouds look close, Daddy?" the little boy asked with excitement. The father smiled and nodded. "Yes, very close. Hey, you'll see the world from above." The girl leaned toward her mother. "Can I look out the window when we're up in the sky?" Her mother gently stroked her hair and said, "Of course, sweetheart." Their voices were soft, filled with warmth, and they caused no disturbance. But the flight attendant, instead of noticing their kindness, kept building her own picture in her head. She thought they were pretending to be more than they were. She couldn't explain why she felt this way, but she trusted her gut more than facts. Each time she passed their row, she looked at them longer than the others. The father noticed this but stayed silent, choosing not to react. The family, unaware of what was coming, continued to prepare for the flight. They buckled their seatbelts, arranged their things, and spoke quietly. The father held his wife's hand for a moment, smiling as if to say, "This will be a good trip." The children giggled softly as they compared the small in-flight magazines. To them, this was an adventure. To him, it was just another business trip, though he valued the chance to spend time with his family. Outside, the airport ground crew moved busily. The luggage was being loaded, the pilot was finishing checks, and the engines hummed with power. Inside, the air felt calm for most people, but not for the flight attendant. She kept replaying the image of the family in her mind, asking herself if she should take action. A part of her wanted to simply let them be. Another part of her, stronger and more stubborn, whispered that something was not right. As the doors closed and the flight prepared to take off, the family relaxed in their seats. The little boy leaned against his father's arm, already dreaming about flying above the clouds. The mother gave a gentle smile, her eyes full of love as she looked at her children. The father looked straight ahead, unaware that the peace of this moment was only temporary. For him, was supposed to be a simple journey with his loved ones, a chance to combine work with family time. He had no idea that within minutes, everything would change. The quiet dignity they carried would soon be tested. The very airline he helped build would become the stage for a painful lesson in respect and fairness. But at that moment, none of them knew what was waiting. To the children, it was only a fun ride in the sky. To the wife, it was quality time with her husband and kids. To the husband, it was just a flight to ordinary, normal, nothing more. Yet for the flight attendant, it was already becoming something different. In her mind, a line had been drawn, and she was ready to act. The plane had not even lifted from the ground, but the story had already begun. A simple flight, a quiet family, a suspicious attendant, a mistake so big it would soon echo across the entire airline world. Asterisk, the plane had not yet taken off, but already the atmosphere was shifting. Most passengers were busy adjusting their seats, finding a comfortable position, or chatting with their companions. The sound of bags being pushed under seats and the click of seatbelts echoed across the cabin. It was the usual rhythm of boarding. But for one row in particular, the feeling was different. The flight attendant, who had been restless since the family stepped on board, decided to check on them again. She walked down the aisle with sharp footsteps, her uniform neat, her face carrying a look of authority. She stopped by the family's row and leaned slightly forward, her voice firm but polite on the surface. "May I see your boarding passes?" "Again, please," she asked. The father, calm and respectful, looked at her with mild surprise. He had already shown the tickets while boarding. Still, without complaint, he reached into his pocket and handed them over. His wife glanced at him, her eyes asking silently if everything was okay. The children went quiet, sensing something unusual in the air. The attendant studied the tickets longer than necessary, her eyes moving back and forth as if searching for a hidden flaw. She frowned slightly. "These are first-class tickets," she finally said, her tone carrying suspicion. "You are seated in the right section, but are you sure this is correct?" The father nodded gently. "Yes, it is correct. We purchased these tickets." His voice was steady, respectful, but also firm enough to leave no doubt. Still, the attendant didn't seem satisfied. She glanced at the mother, who sat quietly with her daughter, then back at the father. "It's just unusual," she said, slowly, "for a family to be placed here." The words hung in the air. They weren't spoken loudly, but they carried weight. A few nearby passengers raised their eyebrows, now watching the scene more closely. The businessman with the laptop paused his typing, pretending not to listen but secretly curious. The elderly woman folded her newspaper. Frowning at the exchange, the father's jaw tightened slightly, but he forced a calm smile. "Madam," he said softly, "is there a problem with our tickets?" The attendant hesitated. In truth, she had no real problem. The tickets were perfectly valid. The family had every right to sit where they were. But her inner doubt, born from prejudice and assumptions, pushed her further. "I'll need to double-check with the captain," she muttered, handing the tickets back without another word. As she walked away, whispers began to spread among the passengers. Some shook their heads, clearly uncomfortable with what they had just witnessed. Others leaned in closer to their companions, whispering quietly. The children looked up at their father with wide eyes. "Daddy, did we do something wrong?" The little girl asked. He shook his head quickly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "No, sweetheart. We did nothing wrong. Just sit tight. Everything is fine." His voice was calm, but inside his chest, a storm was brewing. He was used to unfair treatment in many places, but never in such a public, humiliating way, especially not in front of his children. The mother reached out, squeezing his hand. Her eyes were steady, filled with silent strength. She didn't need to speak. Her presence told him to stay calm, to keep his dignity. to show their children how to face this moment with grace. Meanwhile, the attendant stood near the front of the plane, speaking in hushed tones with another crew member. Their eyes flicked back toward the family now and then, their expressions tight. The other crew member looked uneasy, almost as if they knew this was going too far. But the attendant's determination was set. She had convinced herself that something was wrong, and she would not let it go. When she returned, her tone was sharper, though she tried to disguise it with a forced smile. "I'll have to ask you to step off the plane for additional verification," she said. Gasps came from several passengers nearby. The elderly lady spoke up for the first time, her voice trembling, but clear. "Why? Their tickets are valid. I saw them. Why are you singling them out?" The attendant's cheeks flushed red. She didn't expect anyone to interfere. "Ma'am, this is a matter of procedure," she replied stiffly. "Please remain seated." The father took a slow breath. His children's eyes were locked on him, searching for comfort. He stood halfway, his movements calm and deliberate. "If you wish to check again, we will cooperate," he said, his voice steady as steel. "But please remember, we have done nothing wrong." Every eye in the cabin followed him. The atmosphere had changed completely. What began as a routine flight was now turning into a public trial, with the family at the center. The passengers could feel the injustice, though some stayed silent. Out of fear of making things worse, the children clutched their mother's hands. Their excitement about flying replaced by confusion and fear. The mother whispered softly to them, her words meant only for their ears. "Stay strong. Just breathe. Everything will be okay." But even as she spoke, her heart ached. She knew the humiliation was only beginning, and the flight attendant, standing tall with false confidence, felt a surge of power. She believed she was doing the right thing, following instinct and rules. But what she didn't know was that her decision would soon backfire in a way she could never have imagined. The plane was still on the ground, but the story had already taken flight. The first tension had turned into something much larger, a storm of whispers, judgments, and silent anger that filled the cabin. And in the middle of it all, a family held on to their dignity, not knowing that the next moments would change everything. The cabin was tense. The air, once filled with the ordinary sounds of travel seatbelts clicking, overhead bins shutting, quiet laughter had now turned heavy and uncomfortable. Everyone could feel it. The family sat still, their dignity intact, but their silence only made the tension louder. The flight attendant stood tall at the front of the row, her face stiff with authority. She had convinced herself she was right, that something about this family did not belong. And now, with dozens of eyes on her, she doubled down. "Sir," she said, raising her voice so that everyone nearby could hear, "you and your family will need to step off the aircraft immediately. Your seating cannot be verified, and until it is, you cannot remain here." The words fell like a hammer. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Some passengers turned their heads away, too afraid to get involved. Others stared openly, their eyes wide with disbelief. The businessman with the laptop stopped typing altogether, frozen mid-keystroke. The elderly woman pressed a hand to her chest, shaking her head. The father rose slowly, his tall frame commanding attention even without a word. His wife looked up at him, her eyes calm but pained, and the children clung to her arms, their small faces filled with confusion. The father's voice, when it came, was steady and controlled. "We have shown our tickets. They are valid. We have done nothing wrong." But the attendant's voice cut through his words. "You are disrupting the boarding process. Please, gather your belongings and exit the plane." The humiliation was complete. The family was no longer passengers. They were being treated like intruders, like criminals. The children's eyes darted around the cabin, taking in the stares of strangers. The little girl whispered to her mother, her voice trembling. "Mommy, why do they want us to leave? Did we break the rules?" The mother's heart cracked, but she pulled her daughter close and whispered, "No, sweetheart. We did nothing wrong." Her words were soft, but the look in her eyes was one of fierce strength. She wanted her children to remember dignity, not shame. The father bent down, collecting their bags with slow, deliberate movements. He would not give the flight attendant the satisfaction of seeing him rush or panic. Every gesture he made carried quiet power, though his chest burned with anger. He knew his children were watching, learning how to respond to injustice. He had to show them strength, not rage. Passengers watched in silence, caught between outrage and fear. Some shook their heads. A young woman whispered to her friend, "This is wrong." They didn't do anything. But her voice never rose loud enough for the crew to hear. Others just looked away, unwilling to risk conflict. The elderly woman finally spoke again, louder this time. "This is shameful," she said. "They showed you their tickets. Why are you treating them this way?" Her voice wavered, but carried weight. A few passengers nodded in agreement, but the flight attendant's face hardened. She would not back down now, not with the eyes of the cabin upon her, ma'am. The attendant snapped, "Please remain quiet. This matter does not concern you, but it did concern everyone." The injustice was plain to see. The family was being expelled, not for what they did, but for who they were. The father stood tall now, his bag in hand, his son clutching his arm. He looked around the cabin, meeting the eyes of strangers. Some looked away in shame. Others held his gaze with silent sympathy. He wanted to speak, to shout, to call out the unfairness of it all. But instead, he swallowed his words. "Come," he said gently to his family. His voice trembled only slightly. "We will leave." The family began the slow walk down the aisle, each step heavy with humiliation. The children walked close, their small hands gripping tightly to their parents. The cabin seemed to grow quieter with every footstep, the silence broken only by the soft click of the mother's heels on the floor. As they passed row after row, the passengers' faces told the story better than words could. Some looked horrified, others guilty, others simply blank with shock. The businessman shut his laptop and lowered his eyes, unable to face them. The elderly woman whispered a prayer under her breath. The walk felt endless, a public display of disrespect. For the family, every step was a reminder that no matter their dignity, their success, or their calmness, they had been judged unfairly. The father's back remained straight, his eyes forward, refusing to let the humiliation crush him. His wife walked with quiet grace, her hands steady on her daughter's shoulder, at the front of the plane. The flight attendant stood with arms crossed, convinced she had done her duty. She believed she had removed a problem, not realizing she had created one far greater. The family stepped out of the cabin, disappearing down the jet bridge. The door closed behind them with a dull, final thud. Inside, the silence was deafening. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, some angry, some ashamed, but none willing to speak further. The air felt heavy, as though the entire plane had witnessed something that should never have happened. The elderly woman finally broke the silence, whispering to no one in particular, "You'll regret this. You don't know who they are." Her words lingered in the air, soft but sharp, like a warning. The flight attendant glanced at her, unease flickering across her face for the first time. She brushed it aside, telling herself she had done the right thing. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted, and outside the plane, the family gathered themselves. The father's face was calm but unreadable, his mind racing. He had chosen dignity over confrontation for now. But this story was far from over. The humiliation they had suffered was about to return to the very people who caused it, in ways no one on that plane could imagine. The passengers would soon learn the truth. And the flight attendant would face a reckoning she never saw coming. Asterisk. The door had closed behind the family with a hollow sound that seemed louder than anything else in the cabin. For a long moment, no one spoke. It was as if the entire plane had been stripped of air. The flight that once felt ordinary now felt tense, cold, filled with unspoken thoughts. The passengers shifted in their seats, uncomfortable but unwilling to break the silence. Eyes darted from one face to another, some looking at the flight attendant with quiet judgment, others lowering their gaze to avoid being involved. The businessman who had been typing earlier shut his laptop completely and stared at his reflection in the darkened screen. His fingers tapped nervously against the closed lid, but he said nothing. The elderly woman who had tried to defend the family sighed heavily. She folded her arms across her chest and shook her head. She wanted to speak again, to call out the injustice, but she knew her voice alone would not change anything. Her words earlier had been dismissed, ignored as though they were nothing more than noise. Still, she whispered softly to herself, "This is wrong. So very wrong." Across the aisle, the young couple who had been laughing and taking selfies earlier now sat stiff and silent. The woman's eyes were wide with discomfort, while the man chewed nervously on his lip. They exchanged glances, both thinking the same thing but too afraid to say it. They had just witnessed something unfair, and their silence made them part of it. The children's voices no longer echoed in the cabin. The giggles, the innocent questions about clouds, the small spark of excitement, all of it had vanished when the family was forced to leave. The absence of those cheerful sounds made the silence heavier, like a blanket pressing down on everyone inside. The flight attendant returned to her duties, but even she could not escape the shift in atmosphere. She walked down the aisle with a clipboard in her hands, her back straight, her face set in a mask of authority. But her steps felt heavier than before. Each glance from a passenger carried weight, judgment, disappointment, and quiet anger. She avoided their eyes, pretending not to notice. When she reached the middle of the cabin, the elderly woman spoke again, her voice low but clear enough for those nearby to hear. "Mark my words, this will not end here." The attendant froze for half a second before forcing a smile and replying curtly, "Ma'am, everything is under control. Please relax." But her words didn't convince anyone. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of peace, it was the silence of unease, of something unfinished, something wrong. In the back rows, murmurs began. Two college students leaned toward each other, whispering. "That was messed up," one of them said. "They didn't do anything." The other nodded quickly. "Yeah, but what can we do? If we say something, they'll kick us off too." Their words captured the feeling of many passengers, anger mixed with helplessness. The uneasy silence grew deeper when ground staff entered the cabin. They spoke quietly with the flight attendant, their expressions serious. A few passengers noticed the way their faces paled when the attendant explained what had happened. The staff exchanged glances, clearly disturbed, before walking back out. Nothing was explained to the passengers, leaving them with more questions than answers. The businessman finally leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes. But behind his closed lids, the image of the family being forced out replayed again and again. He tried to tell himself it wasn't his business, that he needed to stay out of it, but guilt pricked at him like tiny needles. He had power, money. Influence said he had stayed silent, just like the rest. The young couple whispered again. "Do you think they'll file a complaint?" The woman asked. "Of course," her partner replied. "I would. That was humiliating." She shivered and nodded. "I wouldn't want to be in that attendant's shoes if they do." Everywhere on the plane, passengers were thinking the same thing. Who was that family? And why did the attendant treat them like that? The questions hung in the air, unspoken but loud in everyone's mind. And then came the whisper that changed everything. The elderly woman leaned slightly toward the man sitting next to her, her voice a mix of pity and certainty. "You don't know who they are," she murmured. "That family, they aren't just any passengers. Mark my words, this will come back on her." The man frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" She only shook her head, her lips pressed tightly together. She didn't explain further, but her words lingered like smoke in the cabin. The passengers who overheard began to trade glances. The silence shifted again, now carrying curiosity mixed with tension. The flight attendant, though pretending to remain calm, felt the weight of those stares. Her confidence wavered for the first time. She adjusted her uniform, held her chin higher, and told herself she had acted according to rules. But deep inside, a tiny crack appeared in her certainty. The plane still hadn't taken off, and already the journey felt cursed. A routine flight had turned into a stage for something much bigger. The silence was no longer just uncomfortable, it was charged, electric, filled with anticipation. Everyone felt it, though no one knew exactly why. The family, now out of sight, still lingered in the minds of every passenger. Their calm dignity, their soft voices, the way they had carried themselves even in humiliation, all of it stuck like a shadow in the cabin. And though the passengers didn't yet know the truth, they sensed it. Something about that family was different. Something about them mattered, and when the truth finally came, it would shake the very walls of the airline. For now, the silence held. Uneasy, heavy, and waiting for the storm that was already on its way. The plane was still grounded. But it no longer felt like an ordinary flight. The uneasy silence from before had turned into restless energy. Passengers kept shifting in their seats, glancing at the aisle, waiting for something more to happen. The family was gone, but their absence echoed through the cabin like a haunting. Shadow, the flight attendant, busied herself with small tasks, straightening magazines in the seat pockets, checking overhead bins, adjusting her clipboard. Her movements were sharp and restless, as if she were trying to shake off a feeling she could not name. She told herself she had done her duty. She told herself she had followed the rules. But deep down, her chest felt heavy. Every glance from the passengers stung like a silent accusation. She tried to ignore it, but she couldn't ignore the sudden commotion near the front of the plane. 2 ground staff members had returned, their faces pale and tense. One leaned close to the captain's door, whispering urgently. The other pulled the flight attendant aside, their voices hushed but hurried. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, straining to hear. They couldn't make out the words, but they saw the shift in expressions. The ground staff looked nervous, their brows furrowed. The flight attendant's face drained of color, her confident mask cracking. She shook, her head in disbelief, her voice rising just enough for those nearby to catch a few words. "You're joking. That's not possible." The staff member shook his head firmly. "It's true. That was the CEO, the owner of the airline. You just forced him and his family off his own plane." The words struck her like lightning. For a moment, she simply froze, her mouth opening but no sound coming out. Her hands trembled, her clipboard slipping slightly from her grip. She had been so certain, so proud of her decision, but now the truth hit with crushing weight. Nearby passengers gasped, some covering their mouths, others whispering loudly now. The news spread through the rows like wildfire. "Did you hear that? The family, they own the airline," one man whispered. The young couple's eyes widened in shock, and the businessman finally sat up straight, his guilt turning into astonishment. The elderly woman who had spoken earlier gave a small, bitter laugh. "I told you," she said softly, though her voice carried enough for several people to hear. "I told you this would come back on her." The atmosphere inside the cabin shifted instantly. The silence of unease transformed into a buzz of whispers, a low storm of voices rising and falling. Some passengers shook their heads in disbelief. Others looked directly at the flight attendant, their stares sharp with judgment. She felt each, one like a dagger. Her heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to deny it, to say it wasn't true. But the ground staff's serious faces told her there was no mistake. She had humiliated the very man whose name was printed on every uniform paycheck, every company memo, every aircraft tale. And she hadn't just embarrassed him, she had done it in front of his wife and children, in front of strangers, in front of witnesses who would not forget. The captain's door opened slightly. And even he looked unsettled. He spoke quickly, with the staff nodding gravely. Within minutes, a decision was made. The CEO and his family would be escorted back onto the plane. Passengers straightened in their seats, eyes glued to the aisle. The whispers grew louder, curiosity and anticipation, buzzing like electricity. Some were already imagining the confrontation that was about to unfold. And then, the moment arrived. The jet bridge door opened, and the family stepped back inside. This time, they were not walking alone. A senior ground manager walked with them, his posture respectful, almost protective. Other staff followed behind, their expressions tense. The children walked close to their mother, who held their hands firmly. The father walked at the front, his head held high, his expression calm but unreadable. The cabin fell completely silent. Every passenger turned to watch as the family walked down the aisle, the same aisle they had just walked minutes before in humiliation. Now they returned with quiet strength, each step heavy with dignity. The father did not look at the flight attendant, not yet. His eyes stayed forward, his face controlled, though there was no mistaking the power in his silence. His very presence commanded the room in a way no raised voice ever could. The mother walked gracefully beside him, her chin slightly lifted, her hand steady on her daughter's shoulder. The children, though still confused, seemed calmer now. Reassured by their parents' strength, passengers stared in awe, some whispering, others sitting back with guilty looks. They had witnessed the family's humiliation, and now they were witnessing their return, not as ordinary travelers, but as the very owners of the airline. The flight attendant stood frozen near the front, her face pale, her throat dry. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came. The truth was undeniable now. She had not only insulted innocent passengers, she had insulted the people who had the highest authority on the very plane she worked on. The elderly woman watched the scene unfold with sharp eyes. She leaned back in her seat, whispering again. Now the real lesson begins. The family returned to their seats quietly, without arrogance, without anger. The father helped his children sit down again, his movements calm and deliberate, just as before. But this time, the silence around them was filled with respect. The same passengers who had watched them with pity or judgment before now looked at them with awe. And the flight attendant, trembling in place, realized the truth she could no longer escape. One mistake, born of bias and arrogance, had destroyed everything she thought she controlled. The revelation had begun, and the reckoning was only moments away. The cabin was silent as the family walked back to their seats. But it was not the same silence as before. Earlier, it had been the silence of unease and shame. Now, it was the silence of awe. Every passenger could feel the shift, as if the air itself had grown heavy with the weight of truth. The father, the CEO of the airline, moved with calm, measured steps. There was no rush, no anger in his walk, but every step carried quiet authority. His tall frame seemed larger now, not because he tried to appear powerful, but because power lived in the calmness of his presence. He didn't need to shout or demand respect. It followed him naturally, like a shadow. His wife walked beside him, her head slightly raised. Though her heart ached from the humiliation they had endured minutes earlier, she wore an expression of calm grace. Her hand rested gently on her daughter's shoulder, steadying her, reassuring her. The children walked close, their faces still, filled with confusion, but their parents' composure gave them courage. Passengers followed their every move with silent eyes. Some looked at them with respect, others with guilt. Many couldn't believe they had just witnessed such a dramatic reversal. A few people even exchanged whispers. "That's really him? The owner of the airline?" "Yes, I heard the staff say it. My God." And they kicked him off his own plane. The whispers were soft, but the flight attendant heard them. Each word was like a knife cutting deeper into her chest. She stood near the front of the plane, frozen, her once confident posture now trembling under the truth. Her throat was dry, her palms damp with sweat. She had never felt so exposed. So vulnerable, the CEO finally reached his row. He helped his son climb back into his seat, then guided his daughter gently beside her mother. He adjusted their seatbelts with slow, careful hands. The passengers noticed the tenderness in his actions. Despite the humiliation he had faced, his focus was still on his family, on protecting them from further pain. Only when his children were settled did he lift his gaze. His eyes met the flight attendants for the first time since returning. That single look carried more weight than any words. His eyes were calm but sharp, filled with quiet disappointment rather than rage. And somehow, that disappointment was far more powerful, far more crushing than anger could have been. The flight attendant's chest tightened. She wanted to speak, to apologize, to explain, but no words formed. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, her lips trembling. What excuse could she offer? What reason could she give that would erase what had happened? None. The passengers, still silent, waited for him to act. Some expected him to explode in fury, to demand her immediate removal in front of everyone. Others thought he might lecture her harshly, exposing her failure. But he did neither. Instead, he simply sat down beside his wife, fastening his seatbelt. His silence spoke louder than any outburst ever could. His presence alone, his refusal to shout, made the humiliation of the flight attendant more complete. She could feel the eyes of every passenger on her, judging her now instead of the family. The elderly woman, sitting a few rows back, gave a small nod of approval. She whispered softly to herself, "That is true power." Calm, quiet, unshaken. The businessman who had remained silent earlier now felt shame burn in his chest. He realized he had chosen cowardice over courage when he saw injustice, and now, the truth only made him feel smaller. He turned his gaze to the window, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The young couple squeezed each other's hands. They had never seen dignity carried with such strength. "Did you see how calm he is?" the woman whispered. "If it were me, I would have screamed." Her partner shook his head slowly. "That's why he's who he is. That's why he owns the airline. People like him don't need to scream to be heard." Meanwhile, the flight attendant stood frozen, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her breathing uneven. She had been the one with authority minutes ago, the one who gave orders. Now she was the one judged, the one stripped of power. She felt smaller with every passing second, shrinking under the weight of silence. The CEO finally leaned slightly toward his wife. His voice was low, but passengers nearby could hear his words. "Are you all right?" he asked. His wife gave a soft smile, her hand covering his. "We're fine," she said, though her eyes betrayed the pain still lingering. The children nodded, trying to be brave. Though the little girl still clutched her mother's arm tightly, he nodded once, giving them reassurance. Then he leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes briefly as if to gather strength. The entire cabin waited, holding its breath, wondering if he would address the passengers. If he would say something that would turn the silence into action. And, deep inside, the flight attendant knew her fate was sealed. Whether he spoke or not, her mistake had been carved into stone. Every passenger had seen it. Every witness would remember it. And soon, the airline itself would hear about it from the very man whose name was written above them all. Still, he did not shout. He did not demand. His return alone had already shifted the balance completely. He had gone from victim to leader in a matter of minutes, not through force, but through dignity. The passengers felt it. The silence, once heavy with unease, was now heavy with respect. Respect for the family who had endured humiliation with grace. Respect for the man whose quiet power spoke louder than anger ever could. And as the plane prepared to finally take off, everyone knew the story was not over. The true reckoning had not yet come. But when it did, it would leave a mark not only on the flight attendant, but on everyone who had witnessed this unforgettable moment. The storm was no longer in the air outside. It was here, in the cabin, waiting to break. Asterisk, the engines rumbled softly as the plane prepared for takeoff. But inside the cabin, no one was thinking about flying. All eyes, all thoughts were locked on the family who had just returned to their seats. The weight of what had happened still hung in the air, pressing down on everyone like a storm cloud waiting to burst. The CEO sat quietly for a long time, his eyes closed, his hand resting on his wife's. The passengers waited, silently wondering if he would speak, if he would address what had just happened. The flight attendant stood stiff at the front of the cabin, her heart pounding, knowing every second of silence pushed her deeper into shame. Then, slowly, the CEO opened his eyes and looked around. He didn't rise to his feet, not yet. He simply turned his head, meeting the eyes of those near him. One by one, passengers lowered their gazes, unable to hold his calm but piercing stare. Even in silence, his presence demanded attention. Finally, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. The motion alone pulled the entire cabin into stillness. The rumble of the engine seemed to fade, the whispers vanished, and every single passenger leaned forward, waiting. He spoke softly, but his voice carried. It was not the voice of a man shouting in anger, it was the voice of a leader, steady, controlled, and filled with weight. "What just happened here," he began, "was not only humiliating for me and my family. It was humiliating for this airline and for every person who witnessed it." A ripple went through the passengers. They hung on to his words, their guilt and curiosity mixing like fire and smoke. He looked at his children for a moment, his face softening. My son and daughter should never have to ask why they were treated as if they did not belong. They should never have to watch their parents walk down an aisle in shame for no reason. His voice trembled slightly, not with weakness, but with restrained emotion. The little girl, still clutching her mother's hand, looked up at him with wide eyes. Her father gave her a reassuring nod before turning back to the passengers. "Dignity," he said firmly, "is something every passenger deserves. Whether you are dressed in a suit or in old clothes, whether you sit in economy or first class, whether anyone knows your name or not, to deserve respect." The elderly woman nodded quietly, tears glistening in her eyes. Several other passengers bowed their heads. Ashamed of their silence earlier, the CEO's eyes moved toward the flight attendant. She stiffened, her breath caught in her throat. For a long moment, he said nothing, just looked at her with calm, steady eyes. That look alone made her knees weak. When rules are used as weapons instead of guidance, he said finally, "They do not protect people, they harm them. And when assumptions take the place of truth, injustice follows." His words struck like arrows, sharp but calm, undeniable. The passengers shifted, some exchanging guilty looks. They knew they had sat silently while the family was humiliated. They had chosen fear over courage. His words weren't just for the flight attendant. They were for everyone who had witnessed and done nothing. The CEO paused, his silence heavy but powerful. Then he continued, his tone softening. I am not here to shout or to punish in front of you all. Anger is easy. Dignity is harder. And my family has chosen dignity. He looked down at his wife, who gave him a small smile of strength. Then, back at his children. What they learn from this moment matters more than what happens to me. The young couple near the middle of the plane squeezed each other's hands tighter. They felt the truth of his words deep in their bones. The businessman lowered his head into his hands, realizing how small he had been when he chose silence. The CEO drew in a slow breath, then straightened his posture. His next words came firm, final, unshaken. This airline will not be remembered for one person's mistake. It will be remembered for how it learns, how it changes, how it ensures that no one else suffers what we just endured. I will see to it personally that training, fairness, and respect become more than just words printed on a manual. The passengers erupted into soft applause, hesitant at first, then louder. It wasn't wild cheering, it was respectful, emotional, almost apologetic. Some clapped with tears in their eyes, some clapped to drown out their guilt. Others clapped because they had never seen such composure in the face of humiliation. The flight attendant could not move. Her face burned red, her hands shook. She wanted to speak, to apologize, but no sound came. The CEO's words had already judged her more than any punishment could. She was not just facing him, she was facing the entire cabin, every witness, who now knew her mistake. The elderly woman leaned forward in her seat, her eyes fixed on the CEO. That, she whispered to herself, is leadership. That is strength. The CEO gave a small nod to the passengers, then quietly sat back down beside his wife. His children leaned against him, comforted by his calm presence. He pulled them close, holding them as if to shield them not just from what had happened, but from the world's cruelty itself. The lesson had been delivered. Not with anger, not with punishment, but with dignity, truth, and quiet power. And the silence that followed was not uneasy anymore. It was heavy with respect. Every person on that plane knew they had just witnessed something unforgettable. A moment that would not fade when they landed. A moment that would echo in their minds whenever they thought about fairness, justice, or the quiet strength of a man who refused to be broken. And though the engines finally roared louder and the plane prepared to lift into the sky, no one's thoughts were on the clouds anymore. They were on the family who had turned humiliation into honor. It's the man whose calm words had left the deepest mark of all. The applause slowly faded. But the silence that followed was different now. It was no longer heavy with unease or shamit. It was heavy with respect. Every passenger on that plane sat straighter, their eyes fixed on the family. Some still clapped softly, unable to stop themselves, as though their hands needed to honor what they had just witnessed. The CEO leaned back into his seat, his arm gently resting around his wife's shoulders, his other hand still holding one of his children close. His eyes, though calm, carried the weight of someone who had endured more than anyone should on what was supposed to be a simple flight. But even in the face of humiliation, he had refused to break. He had refused to shout, refused to lower himself. Instead, he had chosen dignity and, in doing so, he had risen higher than anyone else on board. The passengers whispered quietly now. Their tones changed. Words like respect, powerful, and unbelievable floated through the cabin. They no longer spoke of the humiliation, but of the strength. They no longer saw the family as victims, but as figures of honor. The flight attendant, however, stood frozen near the galley. Her face was pale, her hands trembling. Every fiber of her being told her to hide, to escape the eyes of the passengers who now looked at her with judgment. But there was nowhere to run. She had humiliated a man she thought was powerless and discovered too late that he was the very man who signed her paycheck. The man who kept the airline alive. The captain's door opened, and even he stepped out briefly. His eyes went to the CEO, then quickly to the attendant. He didn't say anything, but his silence was full of meaning. He knew changes were coming. He knew this moment would reach far beyond this flight. The plane lifted off, climbing into the sky, but inside the cabin, the tension still hovered. The CEO had spoken with calm strength, but the story was not finished. The final twist was yet to unfold. About an hour into the flight, the announcement system crackled. A voice filled the cabin, calm, deep, and commanding. It was not the captain. It was the CEO, ladies and gentlemen, his voice said, carrying clearly through every speaker. I thank you for your patience today. What happened before departure was not only unacceptable for me and my family, but for you as witnesses. You deserve to know that this airline belongs to you as much as it does to me. When you step on board, you are not just passengers, you are part of something we built to serve, to protect, and to respect. The passengers sat stunned. Never before had they heard a CEO speak directly to them mid-flight. His voice was steady, carrying across every seat like a tide. This incident, he continued, will not be buried or forgotten. It will mark the beginning of change. From today onward, no passenger will ever be judged by appearance, background, or assumption. New training, new systems, and new standards will be put into place. Respect will no longer be a suggestion, will be a rule. Applause broke out again, stronger this time. The elderly woman clapped the loudest, her hands shaking with emotion. The young couple smiled, nodding to each other. Even the businessman who had sat in guilt and shame earlier joined in, his applause loud and sincere, as though trying to make up for his silence before. The CEO's voice softened. I do not wish for revenge. I do not wish for punishment. In anger, I only wish for change, and change begins today. When the announcement ended, the cabin was alive with applause that echoed like thunder. Some passengers wiped tears from their eyes. Others simply sat in silence, overwhelmed by the gravity of what they had just experienced. The flight attendant, however, could not applaud. Her hands remained frozen by her sides. She felt smaller than ever before, shrinking under the weight of her mistake. She knew her career would never be the same. She had not only insulted the CEO, she had betrayed the very values the airline claimed to uphold hours later. When the plane landed, the passengers stood to leave. But this time, the mood was different. Instead of rushing out, many paused near the CEO's row. Some offered quiet words of respect. Thank you, one man said. You taught us something today. A young woman whispered, your children are lucky to have you. Even the businessman, ashamed of his silence earlier, bowed his head and said softly, I'm sorry I didn't speak up. You deserved better. The CEO accepted each word with a calm nod, his dignity never wavering. His wife smiled politely, her hand holding her daughter's as they prepared to leave. The children, though still young, had seen something they would never forget. They had seen their father humiliated, yes, but they had also seen him rise above it with grace and power. That lesson would stay with them forever. The final twist was not only that the family owned the airline. The final twist was the lesson they left behind, that true power does not come from shouting, from punishing, or from pride. True power comes from dignity, respect, and the courage to stand tall even when others try to tear you down. As the CEO and his family stepped off the plane, the passengers knew they had witnessed something that would live in their memory forever. They had not just taken a flight, They had lived through a story of justice, strength, and humanity. And somewhere behind them, the flight attendant sat alone, waiting to be escorted off the plane. Knowing her career and her life had been changed forever by the mistake she would never be able to erase. The sky outside was clear, the sun bright, but inside the hearts of every passenger, a single truth shone brighter than all: never judge by appearance, for dignity is the highest class a person can carry.